Why, you might ask, would I invest hundreds of hours, thousands of dollars, and just the mental exercise of making a bench that's nice as this one, only bigger? Well, it's because I met Ken Jordan 17 years ago, and that guy has taken woodworking, as far as I'm concerned, to its zenith. And then I saw his bench, and I realized, wait a minute, that's not a bench, that's furniture. And if I could learn to build a piece of furniture as beautiful and as functional as that bench, I could probably build anything that I needed, or that my family needed, or that my friends needed. And that would make me somebody who was more than I was before I started this journey. Now, I recognize that this shop is a blessing to me, and it's partially a blessing because I've done a lot of work here before I could even do the work here. I've expanded it, and I've modified it, and I've been blacksmithing and fabricating and all kinds of stuff in that space and in this space as a contractor. And now I've modified it to the point that I'm ready to learn this new skill set. And one more incentive in learning this new skill set is the crazy experience it was to cut down the trees that these boards came out of and get them milled and get them planed and dried and now turn them into something of value, or at least of beauty. So all that to say, it's time to build a bench, and not just a bench. It's time to add a skill set. It's time to connect with new people. It's time to learn from a mentor. It's time to get ready to make some really beautiful things for my family, for my bride, in her kitchen, starting with the Ken Jordan shaker style workbench. So if you're wondering what this is not the Ken Jordan shaker style workbench. This is the beta test model for that bench. It was where I practiced making drawers without hardware. It's where I practiced dovetails. It's where I practiced lap joints, and just so the whole range of processes that I got to have right before I really start on the project that matters. And besides that, I've needed a roll-around base for my planer for a long time. Now, I'm a tool junkie, and so I've geared up. But Kenny built his bench with one table saw, one router, a dovetail jig, and 2 sanders, essentially. Bar clamps and all those miscellaneous things, and wood chisels that he had already. So if you're not as completely overstocked as I am now, you can still do it. But I went ahead and I got some more routers. I got all of the bushing guides and all of the, I bought a new set of Forstner bits, and I just kind of went haywire because I love tools and I wanted this to be a smooth process in the video. But if you have a minimum number of tools and a maximum amount of ambition, you can do this. So this is pretty much everything you got to have, minus the jointer and the planer. And of course, more is better, but this is sort of a basic toolkit, and here's what I like about it. Cordless drill driver. I mean, you got to put some screws in occasionally, even if it's only temporary, but the bench will have a few screws in it. You got to have some kind of a drill. Cordless is nice. You got to have a chisel that'll get sharp and stay sharp. Block plane occasionally. You got to have a router that doesn't stink, and you got to have an assortment of router bits. You got to have at least 1 sander, and 4 is better because you're going to have an assortment of papers, and it's nice to not to have to peel the paper off and throw it away every time you want to step up to a finer grit. You got to have a good, or at least respectable, table saw, and saw stop is good. The fence is perfectly square. The controls are perfectly smooth. It doesn't vibrate, it has power, and oh, by the way, it won't cut my fingers off. So you got to have several bar clamps, like several, maybe like 6 would be a nice number. You don't have to have 60, but you've got to have some. You got to have a square that you can trust, large and small. You got to have some kind of a dovetail jig unless you want to hand cut. I'm not going to try that until my bench is done, and then I'll hand cut some dovetails. But all of these things add up to a significant investment, but not an overwhelming investment. So pace yourself, realize that if we start with what we have, we're going to get further before we die than if we don't start. And let out the clutch, right? Let out the clutch. It's time to pick out the material, start breaking it down with the rough cuts, and planing to finished dimension. Well, after about 2 hours of sorting and stacking and restacking, I've got the boards picked out that I'm going to commit to the bench. It's a balancing act between what you've got left over for your wife's kitchen here in maybe 2 years, if she remains that patient, and what you need to use to make something that's going to be heirloom quality, or at least close enough to heirloom quality that I won't feel bad about putting Ken Jordan's name on it. He provided some guidance for me on, just what I might consider as far as allowable defect, and it's going to be different for you, because after I get done pulling the boards out and cutting them up and building the bench, I'm going to have some left over in the stack that I've set aside, and I'll be able to give you an idea of how many board feet it took to get my bench out of my boards. Your results may vary. So here are the stacks, right here and right here. These I think are mostly going to be drawer faces and drawer sides. In fact, that's pretty much what it's committed to. This slab right here is a 3-inch slab that I'm going to get some of the legs and some of the top and bottom rails for the bench. And then back in here is 2-inch material and a bunch more 1-inch. Like this right here is a board that I'm going to cut panels out of. I can't wait to show you, maybe a week from now, the board that I've got identified to cut and make the door out of. It's feather pattern out of a beautiful crotch that we cut out of those logs. So in any case, I'm out of excuses. I've got the test bench built, the planers on it, the helical head is in there. I've got the plans. Let's get to work. All right, let's open these up. It's time to cut these boards up. So you come up to the first cover sheet, beautiful representation, table of contents, starts with an overview, very helpful, and we're talking about a frame assembly. Then there are other headings for different components that are represented almost as artistic renderings, and then start the machine drawings, the details and the notches and more dimensions. So one of the reasons and advantages of doing that practice bench is that now we can look at it with the top off in order to kind of get an idea of what we're talking about. So the side rails are 2 1/4 by 2 3/4. The top rails on this bench are 2 by 2 3/4, but on this bench are 2 by 2. I don't know if that clarifies anything, but keep in mind that that is a smaller version of what we're working on. So it's been a big advantage for me to have a big old pile of oak to draw from, but none of it is graded. If you're going to a lumberyard, a high-end lumberyard, to buy material, particularly a premium product like white oak, it will certainly be graded, and you can decide how you're going to approach the trade-off between more money for a select board and less waste with the more expensive boards. How much defect you're comfortable with, how many knots and checks and splits and bug holes and heart checks. I mean, there are a lot of defects in different woods, including hardwood. So this slab is, I think, about 30 board feet, probably 30 board feet. If it's $10 a foot, that's a $300 slab. And it's got all these checks in the middle that have got to be cut out. And besides that, it was 120 pounds getting it over here, and I'm old and I'm weak. But you can figure all that out for yourself when you go to buy your material. But for me today, I'm going to cut the center out of this, maybe over on that big saw, I realize now. And on this, in order to get the material out of the edges. And on this one, if I cut into this, I'm going to be trying to get rid of some checks that show up in that feather. Some checks that show up on this side. In fact, I may just use this for smaller pieces and get everything out of the big one. Let's see what happens when we open it up. Now, I don't know if you could hear that or not, but a 3-inch piece of oak sawing through some very sort of tricky grain right through here had a lot of timber bind in it, a lot of stress that was released and pinched down on this saw stop hard, and it started lugging the motor down, but I just kept at it. I don't know how the saw stop safety mechanism responds to a big drag, but it didn't bother it this time, and so far, let me just tell you, this saw has got all the power that I could reasonably ask for, because this was all the board that you can reasonably expect to break down on a table saw this size. I think I've got the good out of this. I got 5 pieces, 2.5 by, varies between 3 and 2 3/4 down on this end. So there should be plenty. Little defect, but I'll tell you what I'm relieved about. That first short piece that I played with had a lot of timber bind in it. Man, it squeezed down hard. Timber bind is tension. Now it's called tension in a wood shop and timber bind in a sawmill. And I can tell you in a sawmill, when you're running an oak log onto a 50-inch circular saw and the whole log squishes down on that saw that's being pushed by 110 horses, it's a scary thing. In a wood shop, it's just scary also. But the saw stop did great, and there was very little timber bind in the big chunk. When I relieved it with a half, I cut halfway through it, and then the rest of the way, there was some popping and squishing. It was squeezing on the front end. It was spreading on the front end and squeezing on the back, but crippling it like that cuts in half how hard it can hurt you. So anyway, I got lots of material. I'm going to start refining this, get it down to the size where it's ready to start planing. So that's it. We've broken those big heavy boards down into these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pieces. These are 2 1/4 by 2 3/4. They will be the bottom long rails and the vertical corners. I have some more milling to do on this to get the 2 by 2 top rails down the long sides. But just consider this for a second, that if you go to a high-end lumber yard and pay more money for a select board, you may not have to work so much to get the quality faces. I mean, these are the presentation faces, and I'm still showing one knot, and there's some checks that I have to deal with. But the other sides, at least on this one, you see there's more defect. That's part of the process of anticipating what you're paying for and what you're going to end up with. That's the beauty, the luxury that I've had of buying 5 oak trees, cutting them into pieces, getting them, on the ground to the mill, to the planer, and into the shop, and now I'll turn them into woodwork. It is a luxury, but there's some expense, because the tree that these pieces came out of, and there's a lot more lumber in this tree, but I think I paid $500 for the tree when it was standing on its feet, and then all the work. So don't be surprised if you get to that hardwood supplier and the boards cost real money. They're worth real money. Thanks for watching Essential Craftsman. Keep up the good work. And by the way, lest I forget, next video in this series, we're going to be starting to cut and plane and surface and work with the end panels, the wide boards that are going to be glued and jointed into panels, much like this one, to go on the Ken Jordan shaker style workbench.